Where will I read from?
Today, we are going to give you a presentation on Bernard Shaw's Pygmalion and Arms and the Man. I am Rajan, Dr. Rajan Barrett, and with me is Ms. Pranjal Joshi, and both of us are going to talk about Bernard Shaw's Pygmalion and Arms and the Man. You can have a look at the slides that we have shown. We have a picture of Bernard Shaw for you.
George Bernard Shaw, 1856-1950. George Bernard Shaw was born in Dublin, the son of a civil servant. His education was irregular due to his dislike of any organized training. After working in an estate agent's office for a while, he moved to London as a young man in 1876. Here, he established himself as a leading music and theatre critic in the 80s and 90s. He also became a prominent member of the Fabian Society, for which...
This slide?
Slide? Previous one? For which he composed many pamphlets.
The next slide.
Next slide, please. He began his literary career as a novelist and was a fervent advocate of the new theatre of Ibsen. He wrote The Quintessence of Ibsenism in 1891. He decided to write plays in order to illustrate his criticism of the English stage. His earliest dramas were called plays pleasant and unpleasant. Among these, Widowers' Houses and Mrs. Warren's Profession savagely attack social hypocrisy, while in plays such as Arms and the Man of Destiny, the criticism is less fierce. Shaw's radical rationalism, his utter disregard of conventions, his keen dialectic interest and verbal wit often turn the stage into a forum of ideas.
Well, the next slide that we have here, we are talking about Shavian theatre and the context. The decline of theatre in the Romantic and Victorian age. The theatre from the Romantics through the Victorian age had lost its vibrancy. This was because with the Romantics, drama became a form of poetry to be read. The only romantic play that could be staged was P.B. Shelley's Cenci. That's a slide of Shaw. Shaw began as a novelist and fails as a novelist, unfortunately. His long prefaces to plays are part of his novelistic art, which he gets into his drama. Shaw's novelistic art and his drama is seen in a play like Androcles and the Lion, which is a play that has a specially long preface that seems longer than the play itself. However, without a long preface, a Shaw play lacks the Shavian quality. That's a stamp of George Bernard Shaw. When we talk about Shaw, we're talking about realism and the stage. Shaw follows the trends in Europe and considers that there are artists like Henrik Ibsen and Anton Chekhov who are known for their realism. These are the two models that could be considered as influences on Shaw's stage or his realistic drama, and for your benefit, they are Ibsen and Chekhov, who are also on the slide. Ibsen was a Norwegian, and in European drama perhaps is as important as Shakespeare, but appears in a much later age. Chekhov is Russian and is also a short story writer. That's a picture of Shaw's realistic drama or his realistic stage. Now, Ibsen was responsible for bringing to the theatre 1. The well-made play, 2. Elements of the mood play, 3. social realism and psychological realism. Now, as we said before, Shaw's theatre was related to Ibsen and to Chekhov's. Bernard Shaw, to read Ibsen in the original, learnt Norwegian himself, and so he reads Ibsen in Norwegian, which shows his interest and dedication to Ibsen. Shaw cannot be thought about without what is called socialism, and belongs to a group called the Fabian Socialist. This is Shaw's politics. Now we have a look in the next slide on socialism. Socialism is a halfway house between communism and capitalism, a kind of a mixed economy where private property or industry and government-owned industries exist together. Now, as far as Shaw's politics is concerned, the Fabians believed that a socialist society would eventually become a communist society. The communist society, understood in a simplistic manner, is a society in which the only enterprise is state enterprise, no private property or industry. Shaw's politics about a capitalist society is one where there is only private industry and privately held and controlled enterprise. Now, when we look at Shaw's contribution to the English stage, which is on the slide, it is true that Shaw revived English drama. This is because of his sparkling dialogues, his freshness of vision, and his contemporariness. The other important element of Shaw's contribution to the English stage, the most important contribution, was that with Shaw, the English stage largely adopts prose drama. In the slide that we have, we say that we must remember that English drama is largely in verse till Shaw's time. This changes with Shaw and is a new thing for the English stage. Now, we must remember that there is something called tragicomedy. It is important to remember, however, that it is hard to write a pure tragedy or a pure comedy, and this is something that we find happen from William Shakespeare's day. None of Shakespeare's plays are pure comedies or tragedies, even though he calls them so. The tragedy of Hamlet is full of comic scenes, and Shakespeare's Twelfth Night is called a dark comedy by J.L. Stein. Shaw's Pygmalion and Arms and the Man are no exception, and they too have elements of tragedy and comedy. Pranjal, would you like to say something?
I'll move on to Pygmalion directly now. Moving on to Pygmalion, George Bernard Shaw's Pygmalion first appeared in 1912. It was first performed in 1913 and was published in 1916. Pygmalion is a tragic comedy that is all about class and human relationships. Shaw was always interested in the sounds of words as well as in their sense and meaning. Shaw wrote Pygmalion on the subject of correct pronunciation.
We have a postage stamp with Pygmalion, which we put up for you.
Now I'll move on to the myth of Pygmalion. Pygmalion is based on the classical legend from Ovid's Metamorphoses about Pygmalion who falls in love with his own sculpture, Galatea. In the myth, Venus, that is Aphrodite, turns the statue into a living woman who then becomes Pygmalion's wife. In Shaw's play, Henry Higgins, a professor of phonetics, is supposed to stand in place of Pygmalion of the myth and is based on a real-life linguist whose name is Henry Sweet. Elizabeth Doolittle, an uneducated girl who sells flowers in a London street, stands for Galatea. Professor Higgins successfully transforms her into a high society woman.
Yeah, that's one of the posters of Pygmalion, the play which is staged somewhere in England.
Shaw's Pygmalion, the plot. Henry Higgins, a professor of phonetics, has a bet with Colonel Pickering, a fellow phonetician, that he can transform Eliza to a convincing duchess in 6 months. Higgins teaches Eliza, whom he describes as a draggle-tailed gutter snipe, how to speak with an upper-class accent, and teaches her the etiquette of upper classes until she is transformed into what is called a lady. According to the myth, Venus, Aphrodite, gives life to Galatea, and similarly, Higgins can metaphorically be seen as giving life to the new and improved Eliza, the Lady Eliza.
Yeah, we have a photograph of one of the early players of Pygmalion, that is Maura Stedham. She plays Eliza Doolittle.
Pygmalion as an adaptation. In Higgins, the audience sees a modern-day Pygmalion, a sculptor in the myth, who creates a creature for his own ambition, project, and entertainment. Higgins is a typical misogynistic male and the perfect foil or opposite to Pickering, who is a kind and a gentlemanly person. These three characters seem to balance one another out throughout the play and create an entertaining picture of high-class Victorian society.
Yeah, this is how they look. Please have a look at the slide.
It's a bit caricaturish, I guess, Rajan.
Yes, it is.
It seems in this society, appearance is everything and elegance can simply be crafted through speech and behavior.
Yeah, we have a scene, a photograph in fact, of Bernard Shaw himself making notes for staging Pygmalion. So please have a look at it, right?
Yeah. Shaw's views on English language. Bernard Shaw, being an Irishman with a sensitive ear which had been trained to value classical musical sounds, disapproved of the harsh and slovenly speech of many people in England. He wanted to start a new English alphabet based on phonetic principles which would provide a separate symbol or sign for each spoken sound, thus enlarging the alphabet considerably. Shaw believed that this exact representation of sounds in writing and in print would bring about correct pronunciation by everyone, and this in turn would break down class distinctions. Shaw's particular disagreement was with Cockney, a London dialect of English, and the language used by Eliza Doolittle. Cockney is not usually regarded as a proper dialect, but is more often condemned as a defect or a disease of speech, where the vowels are not pure and words run together, and is incoherent and unintelligible to non-Cockneys. Shaw's objective was to have a full, accurate and legible script of the English language by simplification or spelling based on phonetics. The theme of social realism. The literary technique that Shaw uses is writing colloquially, whereby he depicts the Cockney accent in his writing. This is a technique used in literature to create a vivid setting and atmosphere and helps to draw the reader into the writing. In this case, the colloquial technique not only serves these purposes but also highlights the stark difference between Eliza's Cockney accent and the upper class accent that she eventually develops. Pygmalion brings art and women uncomfortably together. Higgins's speeches about women are extremely offensive. For him, a woman is an inferior creature, and he actually considers Eliza a low creature. Shaw is not only looking at the idea of women as objects, but also at the role that Victorian women play in society. They dress up and act like coy dolls simply to attract a mate. Shaw brings to light the role of women in Victorian society and also the celebrity-obsessed modern society and the problems that come from this vain behavior. Shaw exposes the shallow politeness of elite society and its hypocrisy. Alfred Doolittle, Eliza's father, mocks at the conventional morality of the upper-class English society. The real humor lies in Mr. Doolittle's plight when he becomes an uncomfortable, conventional rich man after having been a poor but happy dustman.
Yeah, we have a cartoon here of Shaw as a supporter of the women's suffragette movement.
Now I'll move on to the universal problem of education. Every teacher who sets out to fight ignorance is in a similar position with regard to his pupils as Professor Higgins was with regard to Eliza. He leads her towards a new way of life and leaves her at its threshold to go on by herself. This is the universal problem of education. To educate is to give a new life to those who receive the education. That new life produces a lot of discontent with existing circumstances and creates the desire for a different kind of a world. Education often leads to personal and social unrest. For instance, Eliza tells Higgins, "You never thought of the trouble it would make for me." And in which Higgins replies, "Would the world ever have been made if its maker had been afraid of making trouble? Making life means making trouble." Eliza replies, "You know I can't go back to the gutter, as you call it, and that I have no real friends in the world but you and the Colonel." Then she says, "If I can't have kindness, I'll have independence." Higgins taught Eliza more than even he realized. Eliza loses control of her identity through this creation, but finds love, respect, and strong-willed personality in the process. Shaw leaves the outcome open for the interpretation, as the audience is unsure if Eliza will leave her creator or remain with him.
Now I will start talking about Arms and the Man. You can have a look at the slide, Arms and the Man, and we're talking about the title. Shaw tells us that the very title of the play, Arms and the Man, is taken from Virgil's Aeneid. John Dryden's translation of it in English begins with, "Of arms and the man I sing." The glorification of war and the question of manliness is worth observing here. It is also worth observing that Shaw calls it an anti-romantic comedy. Well, here is a slide which gives you one of the performances of Arms and the Man. Well, if you've got to talk about the anti-romantic, okay, the question is, what is the romantic? Please look at the slide, and that is a question that we have to look at. What is the romantic? Now, what is the romantic? Romanticism was a movement that began in Germany in the late 18th century and spread through Europe in the 19th century. It was a movement against the neoclassical decorum, against artificiality, and canvassed for the natural, the rural against the urban, and for emotions against thought. Romanticism also looked at feeling and thought that feeling was more important than thought. For the Romantics, and spontaneity was considered better than stuck phraseology. here is one of the posters that we have for Arms and the Man, of one of the productions, and you have all the characters over there and the setting.
Previous slide.
When we look at some of the elements of Romanticism in Arms and the Man, because without having Romanticism, we cannot have the anti-romantic. A romantic has an idealistic view of over-glorification of events and getting emotionally charged with superficialities, as the picture of Sergius Saranov as hero shows in the play. Raina is taken up with the idea of a fiancé who is a brave military man and who leads a charge in the war and wins it for his people. War has always been romanticized in literature, and the real and bitter cost of it in terms of human life is hardly ever thought about. It is Captain Bluntschli, who is the unknown soldier who enters Raina's room, who makes war unromantic. Bluntschli looks at war from the point of view of what he calls a professional soldier who knew how to survive. Bluntschli is unlike Raina and her mother, Catherine, who live off the grand idea of victory and of honor that is given to a person who wins a war. We've given you a scene of Raina's bedroom. That's the place where Captain Bluntschli comes into. Now we're looking at some of Raina's romantic traits. It is also romantic of Raina to think of Bluntschli as an ordinary common soldier who is perhaps poor. The rich girl marrying the poor boy is an archetypal or stereotypical idea that comes from the romantic. Another romantic stereotype is when Raina knows that Bluntschli is not a pure man, then she wishes to withdraw from marrying him for a spell of time. We have two anti-romantic elements in the play. We have one, the de-romanticizing of war, and the de-romanticizing of love. Let us look for some of the other elements of the anti-romantic. One of the important things about anti-romanticism is the other movement which we spoke about a little while ago, and Pranjal did so also. We talked about Shaw's realism, and here we are talking about the realistic mode becoming the corrective to the romantic. Shaw's social and psychological realism is a corrective to the romantic, and this is what is anti-romantic in the play. The normal romantic story would be a narrative wherein the rich man or aristocrat takes advantage of the poor girl and exploits her sexually. He gets away and she suffers and perhaps commits suicide or bears an illegitimate child for which both she and the child suffer. Here we find that Luca does not allow for such exploitation. Luca stands as a symbol for the changes in society wherein the aristocracy would not be able to dominate the lower classes of society. Equality of classes is what socialism and Marxism preached. We have Paolo Troubetzkoy's bust of George Bernard Shaw, which is made in 1908, for you to have a look at. Well, I would like to talk now about social realism as anti-romantic. Luca, the slide, go back to the slide. Luca demands a right when Sergius makes sexual advances to her and does not get exploited. Luca also uses the language of equality and treats Raina as equal, much to the shock and horror of Catherine Petkoff. The mourning and weeping of the lower classes and the working classes and the romanticizing of their status does not take place in the play. Nicola is looking towards upward mobility and his own business. This is a modern moment in time and things have changed. No one is supposed to feel sympathy or pity for the exploited maid, as she can stand up for her rights, and if she doesn't, then she's a fool. Raina, the romantic or anti-romantic, we are not very sure. When one is romantically in love, one is not in love with the person one professes to love, but is in love with love itself. The play exposes the protagonist, Raina, who is in love with the idea of being in love, but in the end of the play chooses a pragmatic or practical option when she chooses to marry Captain Bluntschli instead of Sergius. When we consider the anti-romantic, we must look at Captain Bluntschli, who says that he started off as a romantic, but now is a professional soldier who does not want to be killed and is not idealistic like a romantic. Bluntschli likes to have chocolate cream biscuits rather than cartridges. This is because survival is important, which makes him anti-romantic. Shaw's version of circumstance as anti-romantic. It is important to consider Shaw's version of circumstance and how a person acquires what she or he acquires not because of his or her genius, as the romantics would believe, but because of circumstance. Here we look at the next slide. The romantics believed that no matter what the circumstance was, genius would overflow itself and become available to everyone. Shaw's understanding of success is realistic because it believes in considering the location where one is placed and what one does with it. Shaw's anti-romanticism is also seen in his depiction of social realism. Luca and Nicola are there in the play to tell us that there is a class hierarchy operating in society, and that too within a modern society that is changing society itself. Nicola has a dream of opening his own business. His clientele would consist of the same people he is now serving, and therefore he is servile and compliant with the establishment that he serves, exploitative as they may be. As far as Nicola's psychological and social realism is concerned, there is both psychological realism and social realism operating in Nicola's character when he is servile and has a dream of opening his business. He is pragmatic and not romantic in his dream. Luca does not see herself as belonging to the servant class or laborer class and would like to move out of it as soon as possible. This is something which we all call upward mobility. If marriage is a way out of the labor class, then Luca will take it. The means do not matter to her, but upward mobility does. Nicola is still governed by an ethics of honesty and hard work to move out of the social class he is in. The play perhaps suggests that he may not be able to get there given his kind of ethical position. Now we look at the anti-romantic and the class position. Catherine Petkoff and Raina Petkoff stand for those who are romantic and are of the upper class. Reality does not matter to them, and they have the idealism which is of romantic origin, for example, the heroism of Sergius. This we come to know from Sergius's own words that it is a sham. Now we look at something that we call Quixotic versus the anti-romantic. Notions of sacrificing oneself for a nation or country is romantic and heroic, but heroes and patriots are looked at as Quixotic by Captain Bluntschli. He actually refers to Sergius Saranoff as Don Quixote tilting at windmills. But Sergius too, at the end of the play, thinks of war as cowardly, because it is a question of attacking those who are weak and becoming a victor and cowering down or bending before the strong. Bluntschli also brings the horror of the war into the bedroom of the most romantic of all the characters, Raina, when he tells her that his being killed in front of her would not be a nice scene to witness. Bluntschli also strips Raina's romantic notions away when he is her chocolate cream soldier surviving on chocolate cream biscuits instead of carrying cartridges to fight. Besides, he breaks the romantic stereotype when he is not the poor man the rich girl wants to marry, but is the son of a rich businessman who asks for Raina's hand. Aristocracy Crumbling as the anti-romantic. We are looking at the play now from a kind of a historical perspective. Catherine Petkoff's romantic notion is associated with a feudal mindset, and she thinks that the Petkoffs and the Saranovs are old, respectable families of Bulgaria. All Catherine's notions are squashed to bits by Sergius's behavior with Loka and his suggested marriage to her. Also, Catherine, looking down on Bluntschli, is overturned when she finds him a rich man. The aristocracy crumbling also implies that the notion of a gentleman is squashed. The notion of a gentleman is squashed by Bluntschli, and the behavior of Sergius, who finds that his behavior with Luca, by his own admission, is not ideal at all. We must remember that in the play, Sergius wants to challenge Bluntschli to a duel, but Bluntschli himself says that he is what you call a practical, professional soldier. So he puts aside the duel as an anti-romantic kind of device. The duel is a romantic device which goes back to the medieval romance, one of the notions from which romanticism is derived, or the word romanticism is derived. Sergius challenges Bluntschli to a duel, but Bluntschli does not even consider it worth the offer. Bluntschli solves the issue by argument and by deflating the issue rather than heightening the emotional charge of dealing with the winning of a duel to prove love, integrity, honor, and respect, ideas which are all considered romantic and were part of what was called the chivalric code in the Middle Ages. Yeah, here we have a picture of the players who are playing in one of the productions of Arms and the Man. Yeah, I think that must be Mrs. Petkoff and probably Sergius. Now we look at the anti-romantic as a kind of a comic device. The comedy derives from the fact that the play uses romantic devices that are picked up and one finds them amusing. While truth is a romantic ideal in the play, one finds that Raina believes she is telling the truth, but Bluntschli proves otherwise. The telling of lies for Bluntschli is not a problem, but is a means of survival, depending on the situation. Here we have a picture of Elizabeth Homan, who acts as Luca in one of the productions of Shaw's Arms and the Man. Quite pretty, isn't she?
Yeah, she's quite pretty.
Now we are de-romanticizing the hero. Now the hero is the ideal romantic hero at the beginning of the play, but one finds that he wins the charge in spite of being a fool. we also, I think we must remember that we have the picture of Sergius Saronov shown to Bluntschli, and that becomes very romantic because the idea is that Raina is in love with Sergius not because of who he is, but because of the uniform he wears and because he's the ideal romantic hero. Had the opposite army not bungled with its reinforcement of cartridges, then the Bulgarian force led by Sergius would have been slaughtered mercilessly. Thus he is called a Don Quixote by Bluntschli, because he just charges without understanding what kind of reinforcements or what kind of ammunition the opposite side has, and he would have been just mercilessly slaughtered. Here is Paul Sanders, who acts as Sergius Saronov in one of the productions of Shaw's Arms and the Man.
He's looking quite aggressive there.
Yes, he is. Yes. Concluding remarks on the anti-romantic, the play thus deals with asking fundamental questions about honor, tact, survival, truth, nationalism and patriotism, marriage and war. It strips away all illusions about a comfortable upper-class morality and upper-class understanding of war and marriage. It shows how deception operates in both marriage and war, and how societies thrive by falsehood and dishonesty. Honor and respectability, thus, is a farce in war and in love. The lady and the gentleman are no more respectable beings, save for accumulated wealth or money and the status that derives from it. At the end of the play, Raina's marriage to Bluntschli is shown to be agreed upon not because of love, but because of money, just as Luca's is to Sergius. Yeah, we have another scene from the play, actual play, a photograph, yeah, which was put up in one of the productions of Arms and the Man.
Quite a dramatic scene there.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Now, Arms and the Man, I've just put it Arms because I've lacked space, so I've put it as down as Arms. And we're talking about something called literary history. While Arms and the Man is a modern play which belongs to what would be called the new theatre of Europe. Yeah, I think we talked about that. Pranjal talked about Ibsen's theatre and the quintessence of Ibsenism. But here, and it's also called New Theatre because it gets in theatre of ideas. New theatre of Europe which questioned the ideals and the ideas of society in a kind of Ibsenite theatre of ideal manners. The play is in many ways like an anti-sentimental comedy. Just remember that we're talking about the anti-sentimental comedy when we're talking about an age called the Augustan age, and we're talking about a kind of a reaction to something called the sentimental novel. We have that in Goldsmith, and we also have that in when we talk about Sheridan's Rivals and also School for Scandal. So therefore our play shares with the Augustan stage, which sought to laugh people out of their follies and foibles, and that's why it's normally considered a comedy, or Shaw would call it a play pleasant. However, the images of blood, war and social realism are not quite the material of decorum that would be part of the Augustan or Romantic age. The vision and style thus make it modern, along with the fact that drama has changed and prose was used on the English stage by Bernard Shaw. Yeah, this is one of the posters that we have of Arms and the Man, and with that I have finished what I want to say, and I think we can thank you for patiently listening to us. And what we can do now is that We can take some of your questions, or if Pranjal has anything to say, let her say whatever she likes.
Well, I would say everything is fair in love and war.
Well, yes, everything is fair in love and war. That is a fairly romantic idea, which the play also uses.
Endorses in a way.
Yeah.
I would rather say that.
Yeah, the play endorses in some ways, and you cannot have the play work without the romantic. The anti-romantic cannot exist without the romantic.
The dichotomy is juxtaposed, I would rather say. Romantic and anti-romantic, there's a tussle between the two, rather. There's undercurrent of a tension between the two.
Yeah. I think we also find that the play is rather neat as far as these things are concerned.
Yeah.
We have Bluntschli coming in the first act, and then we have him coming back later in the play. Okay? And what is interesting about it is that we have Bluntschli, who is a person who is down to earth. There's also a reference to the Bulgarians being dirty, and some people would think that the Fabians, Shaw's society, are not really interested in the society becoming communist. Okay?
Do you think that Fabian society was quite idealistic in its ideas? It's just a random question, which I am quite interested in. Fabianism, was it quite idealistic, and that's why communism was all it...
in a sense, well, when we think of people like our first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, who was directly influenced by Shaw, and his letters to Shaw are known and very famous, well, our own notions are that we had an India which was based on a lot of socialism, and we think that it was derived from Shaw.
Yes.
But I'm not very sure that that is true, largely because there are many people who think that the Fabians have a racist kind of ring to them. And what is important is that because they believe that a socialist society will transform itself into a communist society, they're trying to delay the process. Okay, the idea comes from the Roman general Fabius, who believed in procrastination. And when we are trying to procrastinate, the idea is that we get a certain kind of power. Now, if we are talking about that kind of power, then I think, Pranjal, what happens is we are actually talking about delaying socialism to such an extent that communism never takes place. Okay. I wonder, I'm not a political theorist, and I'm not a political scientist either, but I would think that maybe somebody could look at societies which have actually transformed themselves from socialist to communist, right? I do not think that we have too many societies of that kind.
Yeah. Any questions? That would be really nice if we have some questions there.
Yeah, I have a question for you.
Okay.
You talked about education.
Yes.
Right? And one of the things that we have in Pygmalion is a fact that you have a teacher who educates a student, and then after that makes her so used to his ways that he has to marry her.
Marry her in this context of Eliza Doolittle and and Professor Higgins, I would rather say that she was so habitual because she was actually homeschooled. She stayed with Higgins, and Higgins, she was used to bringing his glasses, putting his slippers under his feet. So it was a kind of dust beneath your chariot wheel kind of a philosophy there. So in this, the female especially was used to and trained by Higgins in such a manner that Higgins became indispensable for Eliza. And for Higgins too, Eliza was indispensable, whether he being haughty and denying the fact that he can live and survive without her. But I could see that tussle, that again the dichotomy between romantic and anti-romantic for that matter. It was education and also a friction which is created between a man and a woman when they know each other too much, when they are acquainted with each other's flaws, and they're habituated to each other for that matter when they are living together. So in that sense, it's also the student-teacher chemistry and also a man-woman chemistry there, friction there. So that's why Eliza finds herself very helpless, and she finds it problematic that now that she's been groomed to talk in a fashion how a high society Victorian woman would talk, but beneath that garb she is that raw female with her own how should I say, her own ways of putting things. So that is quite problematic. I hope I've answered your question there.
Yeah, in some ways, yes, but it's not a very easy kind of thing to do, largely because we are talking about the idea of the romantic, which Rousseau gives, which is an idea which maybe some of us will think is not quite romantic. And Shaw brings this in, largely because it's a question of a relationship between a teacher and a student. And Rousseau, who is supposed to be the father of Romanticism, is the one who says that such kind of a relationship is not advisable and would try to get ethical kind of norms on the relationship between a teacher and a student and say that such a thing is not allowed. So when we're talking about this play and you brought up the issue of the romantic and the anti-romantic, the question over here is with Eliza. And the idea is this a modern kind of understanding? Okay, have things really changed in the modern world, for one, right? And at the same time, Eliza is not quite the kind of student that one would talk about in the normal sense of the term as a student who goes to a teacher. Who pays money,
the conventional
and who goes, a conventional kind of a student. She's not so. I think Higgins picks her up from the streets, and he also thinks that she'll go back onto the streets. But what has happened in the process is that that is not possible.
I've also mentioned that Eliza is a project for her. It's one kind of a project. It is as if he's a scientist and conducting an experiment on a guinea pig. So there again you have, as I've said, that Higgins doesn't hold too high opinion of women. For him, women are objects to be doled, who can be presented as dolls and can be entertained, and who can be passed off as duchess at an ambassador's garden party. So Higgins doesn't have a good opinion on women, where I have a lot of problem on that. I have a lot of problems. Because his opinions on women are quite problematic there.
Yeah, but if you look at Shaw and the slide that we showed, the cartoon of the suffragette movement, Shaw was one of the active campaigners for the suffragette movement, right? And so Shaw outside the play and Shaw writing the play are two different kinds of people.
And I've also read somewhere that here Mr. Doolittle, that is Eliza's father, Alfred Doolittle, is the mouthpiece of Shaw. So Higgins is a person I think is by far, it's far away from Shaw the person, definitely.
But
it's just a passing remark, that's it.
I think you had mentioned the question of Higgins being modelled on Professor Henry Sweet.
Henry Sweet.
Yeah. I think he was a reader in phonetics and linguistics, right? And the idea of the experiment is something that is a part of the linguist's kind of way of operation, and with different kinds of pronunciation, one gathers one's data. So we are talking about the linguistic experiment, but with the linguistic is also what one would call a cultural experiment, which is taking place. Right? And I think the cultural experiment and the linguistic experiment go hand in hand and are terribly disastrous to Eliza. And that is when the social realism comes in, where you cannot artificially lift somebody out of a culture.
And cannot make a person a parrot.
Yes. No, I do not think that she's made into a parrot. I think what happens over there is she's not made into a parrot. What happens is she, as you said at the end of your production of your presentation, is that Shaw actually teaches us more than she learns more than Shaw
actually teaches him.
Higgins actually
Higgins.
teaches.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that is an important kind of thing
Yes.
that we have to consider, that she actually learns more. And what happens when you teach somebody language?
Yes.
Okay, language is a kind of a political tool, and Shaw was very conscious about this kind of tool.
That's why she says, I'll have independence.
Yeah.
Now that I have acquired knowledge, I'll have independence. That word actually signifies Shaw's inclination towards the suffragette.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you, actually, you'd have a different reading of that line. I'll have independence then.
Yeah. Yes, I think that's absolutely true.
We're done?
Yeah.
It's time.
There's more time.
No, they have already signaled.
Okay.
So, this is it. And your last words, Rajan?
No, let's see if there are any questions.
Any
are there
questions
any questions?
It's done? Okay.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank
We've
you
had a
so
wonderful
much.
morning discussing Shaw's Pygmalion and Arms in the Man, and I hope you've learned something from this presentation that we've made. Thank you.
Thank you.